Okay, everybody, good morning. Welcome. We're getting so close to break, and I know we're all already thinking about break, so I appreciate that you guys are even here and that your mind is with me. I think that's great. Last night, I teach a capstone course, which is the first time we've ever done this for seniors, history majors, and they were actually really into it. It was kind of spooky, so I was very happy because I thought this was going to be dreadful. Everybody thinking about spring break, but it was great. So I had asked you guys, I'm giving you a couple of readings today, and there are some things that I haven't assigned yet that we're going to read together. I'm not quite sure how far we're going to get this morning, but I want to start off just by looking at Earth's Holocaust, this short story that I had you read for today by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And I want to talk just a little bit about what its significance is. So I hope you caught it. There are a lot of obvious things in it, and then there are some things in it that are not so obvious. But Hawthorne was very famous in his own day. His best friend was Ralph Waldo Emerson. So there were a whole group of writers around Emerson, like Henry David Thoreau, and people like Nathaniel Hawthorne, who were really trying to form a community of writers and trying to figure out how that community might mean something to American letters. So up to that point, at least to the point that Emerson arose and his whole kind of cohort, most people thought of literature as only being a European thing. Americans had not really adopted it yet. There are a few exceptions, people like James Fenimore Cooper, who writes The Last of the Mohicans. But for the most part, there aren't that many writers in America who are writing in an American style. And so one of the things that Hawthorne tries to do is he tries to give his own stories, and just like Edgar Allan Poe will as well. They're an incredible group of writers at this point. But they're trying to give a specifically American voice to literature. And Hawthorne does it in this case in a very satiric, very cutting way. So I hope you caught, and this should have been the obvious part after what we talked about on Monday, but I hope you caught the idea that Hawthorne is playing with the notion of a tent revival. So all of this kind of preaching that they have going on in Earth's Holocaust is all based on the Second Great Awakening. But if you caught the slyness of all of it, and Hawthorne himself was a pretty rigid church member, certainly was not a kind of charismatic guy at all when it came to his religion. But if you noticed at the end, the preacher, the main preacher who's been instigating all of this throughout the whole moment of the short story, is either the Antichrist or he's Satan. So the guy who presents himself as the good Christian is really leading everybody down to the path of hell. And this is Earth's Holocaust. The idea that with this Great Awakening, what we're really doing is not awakening ourselves to anything old. We're actually just destroying the past. And that's what Hawthorne is getting at, that all of the bonfire, the whole energy of this revival is really about destruction. It's not about creation. Now, this is obviously satire, and it's a parody, so you can kind of take it in a variety of different ways, but there's no doubt that Hawthorne is having fun with this, and he is no fan of the revivals or of what's going on. So quite a bit of opposition in all of this. And if you note at the very end of that short story, in fact, if somebody wants to read, I would very much appreciate it. If we turn to, I should have had this marked better, turn to page 360, right at the bottom there. Alas, and woe is me, thus bemoaned himself, a heavy-looking gentleman in green spectacles. Anyone want to volunteer to read? So that'd be great. Thank you.
Alas, and woe is me, thus bemoaned himself, a heavy-looking gentleman in green spectacles. The world is utterly ruined, and there is nothing to live for any longer. The business of my life is snatched from me, not a volume to be had for love or money. This, remarked the sedate observer beside me, is a bookworm, one of those men who are born to gnaw dead thoughts. His clothes, you see, are covered with the dust of libraries. He has no inward fountain of ideas, and, in good earnest, now that the old stock is abolished, I do not see what is to become of the poor fellow. Have you no word of comfort for him? My dear sir, said I to the desperate bookworm, is not nature better than a book? Is not the human heart deeper than any system of philosophy? Is not life replete with more instruction than past observers have found it possible to write down in maxims? Be of good cheer. The great book of time is still spread wide open before us, and if we read it aright, it will be to us a volume of eternal truth. Oh, my books, my precious printed books, reiterated the forlorn bookworm. My only reality was a bound volume, and now they will not leave me even a shadowy pamphlet. In fact, the last remnant of the literature of all the ages was now descending upon the blazing heap in the shape of a cloud of pamphlets from the press of the New World. These likewise were consumed in the twinkling of an eye, leaving the earth, for the first time since the days of Cadmus, free from the plague of letters, an enviable field for the authors of the next generation. Well, and does anything remain to be done, inquired I, somewhat anxiously, unless we set fire to the earth itself, and then leap boldly off into infinite space? I know not that we can carry reform to any farther point. You are vastly mistaken, my good friend, said the observer. Believe me, the fire will not be allowed to settle down without the addition of fuel that will startle many persons who have lent a willing hand thus far. Nevertheless, there appeared to be a relaxation of effort for a little time, during which, probably, the leaders of the movement were considering what should be done next. In the interval, a philosopher threw his theory into the flames, a sacrifice which, by those who knew how to estimate it, was pronounced the most remarkable that had yet been made. The combustion, however, was by no means brilliant. Some indefatigable people, scorning to take a moment's ease, now employed themselves in collecting all the withered leaves and fallen boughs of the forest, and thereby recruited the bonfire to a greater height than ever. But this was mere byplay. Here comes the fresh fuel that I spoke of, said my companion. To my astonishment, the persons who now advanced into the vacant space around the mountain fire bore surplices and other priestly garments.
Miters.
Miters?
That's like one of those hats that has almost an alligator look.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hey, on the side. Croziers. Yeah, croziers.
And a confusion of Popist and Protestant emblems, with which it seemed their purpose to consummate the great act of faith. Crosses from the spires of old cathedrals were cast upon the heap with as little remorse as if the reverence of centuries passing in long array beneath the lofty towers had not looked up to them as the holiest of symbols. The font in which infants were consecrated to God, the sacramental vessels whence piety received the hollow draught, were given to the same destruction. Perhaps it most nearly touched my heart to see among these devoted relics fragments of the humble communion tables and undecorated pulpits which I recognized as having been torn from the meeting houses of New England. Those simple edifices might have been permitted to retain all of sacred embellishment that their Puritan founders had bestowed, even though the mighty structure of St. Peter's had sent its spoils to the fire of this terrible sacrifice. Yet I felt that these were but the externals of religion, and might most safely be relinquished by spirits that best knew their deep significance.
All right, that's great. Thank you. It's Victoria, right? Yeah, sorry. I should know that by now. But I remember. All right, so what Victoria just very nicely read, we've got this great imagery here of if we're going to have any kind of reform, true reform, it's really going to turn into revolution. And that revolution is going to be really energized by the consummation of the past. So again, I can't stress this enough, Hawthorne is absolutely no fan of the religious revival. He thinks that these are very wicked things, and he sees them as more destructive than they are creative. So all of that is playing out here. And you really get that sense as they're burning the libraries. And I don't know if you caught this, and this is part of Hawthorne just having fun too. But not only did they burn the libraries, but then they burned all the forests so that there could be no more pulp to make new books. So everything is going. And then once that was done, they go for all the church goods. And you might think, because this seemingly is Protestant, that they're only going to destroy all the Catholic things. But in fact, they destroy anything that smacks of any tangible form of religion at all. If it has any substance to it, they burn it. And if you go down from where Victoria read, not only do they burn all of the altars and all of the pulpits, but they even burn the Bible. Right? And this is actually the greatest flash of all that they see at the bottom there of page 362 and the top of 363. They throw in the book of books, the Bible, and it creates this kind of just shock for everybody, and yet they have to get it. And what's going to come after that? Well, next come the people. So there's only one resource left, and that's the human person. And they're going to have to destroy that as well as they're going to keep this bonfire going. So if you turn the page to the last line, or to the last few paragraphs, so on page 364, and what may that be that's right in the middle of the page? Eagerly demanded the vast murderer. What but the human heart itself? Some said, some dark-visaged stranger with a portentous grin. And unless they hit upon some method of purifying that foul cavern, forth from it will reissue all the shapes of wrong and misery, the same old shapes or worse ones, which they have taken such a great deal of trouble to consume to ashes. I have stood by this livelong night and laughed in my sleeve at the whole business. Oh, take my word for it, it will be the old world yet. So unless we kill the human heart, meaning we wipe out everybody, our Holocaust, unless we do that, it's all going to start over again, because sin can never be gotten rid of. And this is really Hawthorne's, it may sound strange, but it's his greatest contribution to American literature. His literature is based on the idea that the human being is fallible. At Hillsdale, that doesn't seem shocking. But in the 19th century, especially with the ideas of progress and the idea of democracy and unlimited freedom and equality, people had kind of forgotten that human beings are fallible, and they were only thinking about the kind of greatnesses of human beings, not of our failings. So Hawthorne is reminding us of that, and he does that in all of his stories. That whether you read The House of the Seven Gables or Scarlet Letter, all of them in some way deal with our foibles, deal with that which holds us back. So there's never going to be perfection in this earth. And you guys, I hope you caught, right, as I mentioned earlier, this dark-eyed stranger, this dark-visaged stranger is clearly either the devil or the Antichrist, and he's loving this. This is what he wanted all along, and he's promoting it. So now they have to make, and we don't really know what's going to happen, but they have to make the decision. The only fuel left are human beings. So do they burn them or do they not? This brief conversation supplied me with a theme for lengthened thought. How sad a truth, if it were true, if true it were, that man's age-long endeavor for perfection had served only to render him the mockery of the evil principle, from the fatal circumstance of an error at the root of the whole matter. The heart, there was that little yet boundless sphere wherein existed the original wrong of which the crime and misery of this outward world were merely types. And so from the fall in Eden up until now, the human being remains flawed, and there's nothing that you can fix from that. So, can the heart change? No, not at all. And I'm sure many of you probably in high school grew up reading Ray Bradbury, and you can definitely get a Bradbury-esque sense here. Something Wicked This Way Comes, some of the other stories, Martian Chronicles, Fahrenheit 451. Clearly, Hawthorne is creating a kind of type of a story, paradoxical, satirical story here. Anybody have any thoughts or comments on it? Okay, so make sure you've read it. We don't really need to spend a ton of time on it. But I do want to introduce, and I think Deidre did this last week, but I want to introduce another concept that is played out during this time period, especially the rise of democracy and the hubris that goes with democracy. We also have this thing, which I know Deidre at least mentioned to you, but probably didn't get into, this concept of manifest destiny. So think about everything we've talked about thus far. We talked about the idea of a republic, the idea of democracy. We talked about the hubris that goes with a democracy, and maybe if there's a great failing of republicanism, it's that it tends to be too insular when it makes errors. It tends to focus in too much on itself, but democracy has the opposite problem. Democracy seems to have this idea that once we've figured out everybody's equal and we have these rights, that then we have this duty to spread that idea everywhere, even to those people who are not willing to do that. And we saw that with Crazy Lorenzo, and especially the idea, as we were talking about right at the end of class on Monday, that with the oceans, God has clearly positioned America not merely as a refuge from the world, but as the great change of the world. So it's not enough that the oppressed can come to the shores of America. Now those oppressed must turn around and make the world like America. And the term that's coined for this, which is first used in 1838 by an Irishman, interestingly enough, and in fact an Irish Roman Catholic who uses it, which doesn't quite make sense, but this whole era is a bundle of contradictions. In 1838, a guy by the name of John L Sullivan says that we have a destiny that is manifest in the American spirit, in which we are going to become something greater than what we had been. And it's, again, not merely a refuge for the world's oppressed and the poor, but a place where we can arm ourselves and then go out into the world and make America very much like or make the world very much like America. So if you turn to page 340, and I'd like somebody to read here. In fact, Devin, would you mind?
Yes,
Sorry, since you actually, Devin, would you mind commenting for a moment? Especially since, is anybody in here had combat experience? Okay, so Devin is you're a great representative.
Here
So
to save the day.
being in the Marines, how were things presented to you about what America's role in the world is?
It's they've tried to actually take a very politically neutral stance. It's just at least at the lower enlisted level. While you're in Okinawa, your job is mainly to be a friendly ambassador. If you are going out, and there are a lot of reasons with that. By the time that I did get over there were a lot of international incidents that came up that, for a lot of reasons that were not relevant, just ultimately gave the Marines and the Navy a bad name.
Okay.
So there were complications with that going on, with a lot of the local nationals going on. But the big thing was just conduct yourself, be professional, at least.
Okay.
That's the idea that they're trying to go on.
Absolutely. So Devin was a Marine, or is a Marine, right? Sorry.
Correct.
No such thing as a former Marine. And I'm curious how they would present that, so thank you. So here's, when you think about what John L. Sullivan is saying here in November of 1839, you have to imagine that here we are. At that point, we were nowhere except in the United States, right? Our military, what military we had, which was actually tiny at the time, only about 7,000 people. It was only to guard the frontiers. And then we were building a few bases in East Coast cities, places like Charleston, South Carolina, where we're building Fort Sumter, and it's taking about 60 years to build. So we've got some military on the East Coast, but the vast majority of our military was on the frontier. And when I say vast majority, you think about, we're talking about several million Americans and only about 7,000 soldiers. So this is not a major profession by any means at all. Now, when we look at the world, we have, as I mentioned in class a couple of weeks ago, there are about 200 countries in the world, and the U.S. has troops in 150 of those. So our troops are in 3/4 of the countries in the world. And you can imagine we allow observers to come see our troops on American soil. But can you imagine if we had an occupying force of New Zealanders or Australians strutting around Portland or strutting around? It's impossible to imagine. But that's exactly what we do throughout the world. And this is really beginning here. The arguments, at least what we're seeing, is what John L. Sullivan is bringing up. What's our role in the world? So how do we move from being this republic, being totally insular, maybe to the point of error? I mean, I think that's an argument to be made. But then going the other way, where in our democracy, we think that it should be everywhere in the world. So Devin, do you mind reading?
Of course.
So just start, I'm going to have you read from the American people there at the beginning to about the middle of the next page.
The American people, having derived their origin from many other nations, and the Declaration of National Independence being entirely based on the great principle of human equality, these facts demonstrate at once our disconnected position as regards any other nation, that we have in reality but little connection with the past history of any of them, and still less with all antiquity, its glories or its crimes. On the contrary, our national birth was the beginning of a new history, the formation and progress of an untried political system which separates us from the past and connects us with the future only. In so far as regards the entire development of the natural rights of man in moral, political, and national life, we may confidently assume that our country is destined to be the great nation of futurity. It is so destined because the principle upon which a nation is organized fixes its destiny, and that of equality is perfect, is universal. It presides in all the operations of the physical world, and it is also the conscious law of the soul, the self-evident dictate of morality, which accurately defines the duty of man to man, and consequently man's rights as man. Besides, the truthful annals of any nation furnish abundant evidence that its happiness, its greatness, its duration were always proportionate to the democratic equality in its system of government. How many nations have had their decline and fall because the equal rights of the minority were trampled on by the despotism of the majority, or the interests of the many sacrificed to the aristocracy of the few, or the rights and interests of all given up to the monarchy of one? These three kinds of government have figured so frequently and so largely in the ages that have passed away that their history, through all time to come, can only furnish a resemblance. Like causes produce like effects, and the true philosopher of history will easily discern the principle of equality or of privilege, working out its inevitable result. The first is regenerative, because it is natural and right. The latter is destructive to society because it is unnatural and wrong. What friend of human liberty, civilization, and refinement can cast his view over the past history of the monarchies and aristocracies of antiquity, and not deplore that they have ever existed? What philanthropist can contemplate the oppressions, the cruelties, and injustice inflicted by them on the masses of mankind, and not turn with moral horror from the retrospect? America is destined for better deeds. It is our unparalleled glory that we have no reminiscence of battlefields, but in defense of humanity, of the oppressed of all nations, of the rights of conscience, the rights of personal enfranchisement. Our annals describe no scenes of horrid carnage, where men were led on by hundreds of thousands to slay one another, dupes and victims to emperors, kings, nobles, demons in the human form called heroes. We have had patriots to defend our homes, our liberties, but no aspirants to crowns or thrones. Nor have the American people ever suffered themselves to be led on by wicked ambition to depopulate the land, to spread desolation far and wide, that a human being might be placed on a seat of supremacy. We have no interest in the scenes of antiquity, only as lessons of avoidance of nearly all their examples. The expansive future is our arena, and for our history. We are entering on its untrodden space with the truths of God in our minds, beneficent objects in our hearts, and with a clear conscience unsullied by the past. We are a nation of human progress, and who will, what can, set limits on our onward march? Providence is with us, and no earthly power can. We point to the everlasting truth on the first pages of our national declaration, and we proclaim to the millions of other lands that the gates of hell, the powers of aristocracy and monarchy, shall not prevail against it.
One more paragraph.
Yes, sir. The far-reaching, the boundless future will be the era of American greatness. It is magnificent. In its magnificent domain of space and time, the nation of many nations is destined to manifest to mankind the excellence of divine principles, to establish on earth the noblest temple ever dedicated to the worship of the Most High, the sacred and the true. Its floor shall be a hemisphere, its roof the firmament of a star-studded heavens, and its congregation and union of many republics, comprising hundreds of happy millions, owning no man master, but governed by God's natural and moral law of equality, the law of brotherhood, of peace and goodwill amongst men.
All right, that was great, Devin. Thank you. So, what's going on here? What's America mean to O. Sullivan? What's he defining it as? Isaac?
In a way, it's kind of like the salvation of the rest of the world, but it's like a forced salvation. Like he talks about, I think at the end of this, talks about like just killing all the kings and tyrants, and then I think establishing maybe his own kind of tyranny of democracy, whether they want it or not.
When Jesus says the gates of hell will not prevail against it, what do we usually interpret that in as scripture? What's it?
Kingdom of God.
Yeah, the church, right? We don't usually think America, but he's substituting that. He's saying, well, no, Jesus meant America, right? America's the church. And so even when he describes what America is, look at the language of what Devin read right at the end. It shall establish on earth the noblest temple ever dedicated to the worship of the Most High, the sacred and the true. Its floor, right? Its floor shall be our hemisphere. Its roof, the firmament of the star-studded heavens, and its congregation, a union of republics. So America is the new church in the way that he's presenting it. And that's astounding. And yet it's not astounding because even when we don't state it expressly, we often as Americans kind of think of it. Now, I don't think we'd go this far and say, oh, come on, this is our church. But we have a reverence for it. We have a reverence for our country in a way that most other people don't have for their countries. And that's unusual. So there are things in O'Sullivan that, of course, he's a great writer. No, it's very purple, his prose is, but it's very good, too. It's very moving. But he clearly thinks that we have this manifest destiny, and our job is to remake the world in our image. So what does the past mean for him? If we handed John L. O'Sullivan the American Heritage Reader and the Western Heritage Reader, what would he do with them? Yeah, Isaac?
Just throw my says like antiquity doesn't mean anything except
Yeah.
importance.
Why would you ever study Cicero? Why would you ever study Livy or study any one of the past, Socrates or Aristotle? What a waste of time. Total waste of time. The only thing that matters is we are the nation of fortuity, right? Of the future. That's all that matters. So this is, you can imagine when someone like Nathaniel Hawthorne is very playfully writing about the destruction of the past. Well, it's all around him. Even John L. O'Sullivan, who is an Irish Roman Catholic, has bought into this idea that America is the future in every way. And of course, the problem is O'Sullivan's not totally wrong, but his emphasis is so uncomfortable, or at least it should be, because of the way that it presents us. And what evidence do we have that this is right? Well, maybe the evidence that Dow gave us, where America is positioned between the two oceans, but it is a faith that you have to take. And the past is worthless. So all we really need to do is understand what the future is. And look at what are we then? Are we as a nation? We are a nation of human progress. That's what we stand for. So this is why the past would be completely untenable or unnecessary for us. We are an understanding of progress. So I want to give you this theory of progress. It's actually a little bit more complicated than we might think. Progress becomes a theory. So if you remember back to Western Heritage, sorry, jumping around a little bit, but if you remember back to Western Heritage and what I showed you in terms of those paintings the other day, everything in history has always been regarded as cyclical until we get to St. Augustine. And then St. Augustine posits that there are two types of history going on. You have the history that's cyclical, spring, summer, fall, winter, birth, middle age, death. But then you also have this element of grace, Christ, that takes us out of this history, out of the cycles of history, takes us out of that trap and puts us in eternity. So you've got now two types of history going on. You've got the cyclical history, and then you've got grace, which takes us out of this. So nobody in history had ever thought that we were always moving towards goodness. In fact, if anything, if there was ever a kind of linear history where we move from one point to another, it would be from Eden to the fall, and then just worse and worse and worse. So many people have posited that there might be a golden age from which we came, and we're declining from that. But the idea that we're ever heading towards a golden age is unheard of until roughly about 1800, 1810. And between these years, maybe we'll do 1820 to give it a little bit more oomph. Between these years, there are a number of German thinkers, people that not quite German, but now we would label them as German looking back, people like Schiller and Fichte and Hegel, who come up with this idea that history is really about a series of events that can be described as progress. And progress, and we see this as one of the first times in American history we're going to see this term, progress has a very specific meaning. And all of our modern progressivism, all of it, whether it's the progressivism of a Republican or a Democrat, it doesn't matter, or of a socialist or a capitalist, all of our modern progressivism is about 200 years old. And again, we're thinking in ways that the world has never, ever thought before. This is radically new in the history of the world, that we're heading towards a golden age here and now. There's always, of course, within Christianity, the golden age, but that's the next world. It was Eden and then the next world because of the redemption of Christ. Never here and now, like what Lorenzo Dow was talking about as well, where we could build the kingdom of God here and now. So this idea of progress really does come from two sources. Number one, these German philosophers, and number two, these Christian religious thinkers who are taking the idea of the kingdom come out of eternity and pulling it down to earth. Right? They're making eminent the things of the eschaton, of the final understanding. They're making them here and now with this idea of progress. And the way progress works is a complicated and yet not so complicated series of steps that all work this way. All progress begins, as the Germans would say, with the idea of a present system, what they call the thesis. So the thesis is anything that's in power right now. So whatever that is, in this classroom, it might mean a dialogue between you and me. But regardless, the fact that I'm of a certain age, I'm in a certain era, and I'm a child of the 80s, all of those things would help shape what the thesis is. Whereas if you had someone like Dr. Wales, who's 15 years younger than I am, you would have a different kind of thesis, but still a thesis. It's whatever the present system is, creates this kind of ethos around us. Hillsdale has its own thesis, which is a little bit different than, say, Michigan State's. And yet we have our own, they have their own. The thesis is whatever is at the present, but almost always defined in terms of what the power is. Where does the power reside? Now, because the thesis is what is, there will always be a reaction against it. And this is where the progress is going to come from. And those who oppose the thesis create, not surprisingly, the antithesis or antithesis. So they are opposed. Maybe you're opposed to the fact that your teacher's from the 80s. Maybe that's cheesy to you, or you think that I should have big hair, or something. Whatever your stereotype might be, you don't like that. So that's a thesis you want to fight against, and maybe I'm too old-fashioned, and you want to fight against that. So you become the antithesis. Right now, we can see that sometimes blatantly, especially on the left, where we see a lot of violent protesters in places like Portland. They're clearly an example of the antithesis in which they're fighting. But there could be a lot of us in the antithesis. Here, one of the most important things to understand about progress and the idea of progress, it is not political. It is not left or right. You can be very conservative and still be a progressive. And you can be very liberal and still be a progressive. You can be a socialist and be a progressive. It's not a left-right thing. It's a way of understanding history. So that's why you can have someone like George Bush, who was as progressive as any president we've ever had. And he's on the right. We could have someone like Woodrow Wilson, who's clearly on the left and can be as progressive as anyone we've ever had. So it can go both ways. But what happens in this theory of progressive history is that neither side, only in the rarest of circumstances, would one side be able to best the other. Instead, history is always the struggle with the present system of power against those who are opposed to it and want their own system of power. So it's always opposing powers. So you've got the thesis and you've got the antithesis. They fight with one another. Neither will be a clear winner. Instead, they create something new. And that something new is the synthesis. Notice how the thesis is always there. You won't forget that. So, syn, thesis, antithesis. All right, so all of this comes together. The thesis and the antithesis fight. Neither of them can win. They become a third thing, the synthesis. So that would mean that me, being born in the 1960s, I rebelled in some way against the hippies. But I couldn't win, and they didn't win. So there are things that the hippies gave me that I took and things that I didn't take. I became a kind of synthesis of a fight between, say, the 1950s of my mother and the 60s of the teachers. And so here I am, that of the 80s. You guys aren't that at all. You're all post 9/11. And so your worldview is slightly different. So if you combat me, you're going to go against me because I represent the previous synthesis, the previous thesis. This now becomes, for all intents and purposes, the thesis. And therefore, when you fight, you become a new antithesis. But you're not going to win. We're going to have to find some kind of compromise. And so that new compromise is the new synthesis. And this is what history is. History is constantly the battling of powers, but never the winning of one over the other, but a compromise. Does that make sense for everyone? So this is history. All of history is a step-by-step process. Now, I doubt if there's anyone in the history department who buys into this. All of us are extremely anti-progressive, and I mean, we don't buy into this theory of history, but it's everywhere. Everywhere you look. And it's interesting because now, of course, it's actually fashionable for many people to call themselves progressive. Maybe not on campus here at Hillsdale, but on most college campuses, it's very fashionable. But when you ask almost anybody what they mean by progress, they hardly ever have anything but a vague answer. So they all believe that we're moving towards something, but they can't say what that something is. Usually, for right now, it means a greater kind of racial equality and a greater kind of sexual equality. And at least this is what they're claiming, what they're saying. And they see that, but it's not totally definite. Whereas when you look at someone like Karl Marx, who was a student of Hegel and of Fichte and of Schiller, when you look at someone like Karl Marx, he has a very definite end of history. History will move towards this point. History will go through these stages, and in the end, will create utopia, a labor utopia for Marx, in which, this would not be my ideal of utopia at all, but Marx's ideal of utopia was each of us wakes up every morning, and we get to choose whatever we want to be. If today I want to be a psychologist, I'm a psychologist. If tomorrow I want to be a sheet metal worker, I'm a sheet metal worker. If the day after that I want to be a shepherd, I'm a shepherd. I think that's bizarre, and why people would die over that is just beyond me. But that's what Marxism is arguing for, this end of we choosing our daily destiny. And millions of people died for that vision. But it is a progressive vision. It's the idea that we're moving towards something. Whereas the standard understanding of Christianity is exactly what St. Augustine said. Sometimes our civilizations will do really, really well. And then they'll fall apart. And that's the norm of things. Everything has a birth, a middle age, and a death. So I can get really, really worked up about creating something beautiful here and now, but it'll be torn down. And we know that. And so we recognize that. The progressive says, no, we can build it and keep building and building and building. And this is why progressivism is both beautiful and unbelievably dangerous. Because if you truly believe that your history is moving towards something, and then you run across a conservative or a reactionary like Devin, who just throws a whole wrench into the machine, well, he can't actually stop the machine, but he can slow it down. And therefore, it becomes really dangerous. So you either stand with history or you stand against it. And the reason the Marxists were okay with killing everyone they were opposed to was those people were opposing the march of history. And therefore it's justified to murder them because they're opposing progress. And that's evil. That's how you define what evil is. So by nature, anyone who doesn't believe in your vision of the future is evil. Does that make sense for everyone? And that's why you can have a Karl Marx believe that. But John L Sullivan believes it just as strongly. It's just his end game is different than Karl Marx's. And if we told John L Sullivan, you sound like a Marxist, he'd probably freak out. But he's not saying anything really different, except his end vision is different than Marx's end vision. And Crazy Lorenzo is a progressive. His end vision is creating the kingdom of God here on earth. That's a little different than Marx's vision, but it's not that different, right? That understanding of creating utopia. So that's why progressivism is both so attractive and so devastating at the same time. Now, you guys, this is Hillsdale. Nobody on this campus is going to give you a pro-progressive. You know that, right? I hope you know that. So we could easily, I'm sure we could find some good progressives who would argue against what I'm saying and say that I'm creating a caricature. So I don't want to leave you with the idea this is what everybody thinks, but it's essentially what everybody thinks. So, and I think we need to think about it that way because now we're entering into this era of progress that we're going to keep seeing. And it could be a democratic progress, but it could be a Marxist socialist progress as well. It's still progress. And that's why it's not political, but it is always politicized. Always. I want this to make sense for everybody. So if I ask you on a test, your midterm, explain to me progressivism. I want to make sure that you guys can do thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and explain where things are going. Okay, good. You're all set on that. Yeah.
So this theory of progressivism is always.
I saw you on Instagram last night, by the way. The SAB had a picture of you. Were you playing a cello?
No.
Don't you play something?
I play saxophone.
Maybe it was a sax. Sorry, the bright shiny thing, not the string thing. There you go. All right. Well, they had an image of it last night. Anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
The underlying theory of progress is it's always. It kind of describes like just like a nature of history, or is it something to think about where it's more prevalent at certain times in the history, like in 1820 or when
Right.
these ideas?
Yeah, great question. So obviously it's only been around for about 200 years, a little over, right? 220 years or so. It's been around. But it's really the best way to think about it is Christianity, but made secular. So Christianity believes we do whatever we can because the kingdom is in the next world. What the progressives say is we do everything we can because the kingdom is in this world. So there are time periods, like in the 19th century, where the belief in progress is almost unrelenting. And then you get into the 20th century, and it's almost unrelenting until you get to the Great Depression. And then suddenly, wait a minute, what happened? And then it changes form. Progress is no longer about democratic freedom. It's about harmonizing the interests of the state to create some kind of perfection later on. And we're in a period, you guys have all grown up in a period where progressivism is generally an accepted part of the discourse. When I was growing up in the Reagan era in the 80s, nobody would have called themselves a progressive. That was an absolutely dirty word because it meant you were a communist. You're a communist, sorry. I'm really 80s here. That would mean you're a communist. And it's only been since the fall of communism that it's become acceptable again to be a progressive, at least in American society. Does that help answer you? So, but there are elements of nature that fit into this. Charles Darwin, in many ways, is arguing that nature is progressive because what is history if not the survival of the fittest in terms of allowing for us to adapt to the circumstances, and we either adapt to the changing climate or we don't. And if we don't, we're out of the gene pool. If we do, we keep going. That's also a progressive vision, but a scientific one. So, yeah. Allie.
So,
And then
the
Steph.
end goal or the view, do they think they can actually reach that? Or do they think that there
Well,
will always be this?
That's the interesting thing. So you get certain progressives like Marx, which basically he says, and I can't remember if I'm exactly right, but I'm close. This is going to happen 5 times. And on the 5th time, that's it. That's the end of history. And when they say the end of history, they don't mean that time stops. They mean that time has reached its purpose. So the end of history means we've reached that stage in which we all are free, or whatever it may be. So, but then for other progressives, like someone like Obama or Bush, when they argue this, there's no real end point except we know it's better. And it becomes a kind of touchy-feely thing. Marx thought it was scientific. But for most modern progressives, it's more we know when it gets better, or we feel it. There's less racism, there's less sexism, whatever it may be. So, yeah, I hope that helps, Allie. Steph?
I was going to ask her a question, but I have another one. So,
Go for it.
So, like, with the examples you gave us of, like, Crazy Lorenzo and Sullivan and whatever, is there, like, an example of the thesis and the antithesis and the synthesis coming, like, in those examples? Because I'm just a little confused.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
concrete examples.
Sure. Well, I can give you an easy one that we're going to come up to, but after your break.
Okay.
So we're not going to get to it yet. In fact, it may still be 2 or 3 weeks. But Frederick Jackson Turner is one of the persons that we're going to read coming up. And he was a very famous American historian. Good guy. Really good guy. But he gives a speech in which he says, what is America? America is the European interacting with the Indian and becoming the American. So the European is the thesis, the Indian is the antithesis, the American is the synthesis. So we're neither, and if any of you saw Paul Cantor's talk last night at the CCA, it was absolutely this. So someone like, for those of you who saw it, Ethan Edwards doesn't fit the narrative. He's the reactionary, doesn't fit. So that's part of John Ford's and John Wayne's great contribution to cinema. But it's still the whole history is that history of the European hitting the Indian, becoming the American, and something new. So the problem, and this is the end of history, what happens when there are no more Indians for us to fight? Well, are we still Americans? That's the question. If I don't have an Indian to fight, am I really an American at this point, even though I'm born on American soil? That's where progressivism is a theory more than a concrete reality because of that ideal. Does that somewhat help? So almost every Western you've ever seen is based on a progressive idea of what America is in some way. Doesn't mean it's wrong. I'm not a progressive at all, but there's some truth in it, but maybe not the whole truth at all. Let's see, Paula.
So if you were to ask us something like this on an exam, would you want us to define progressivism as more of the modern sense or more of like Marxism, that sort of thing?
I think to answer it, you'd want to go ahead and explain it the way I did with the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, but you might want to give an example. An extreme example of this is Marx, which he thought was scientific progressivism, something like that. Yeah, that's good. Okay, great questions, everybody. Yeah, last one. Ken.
Is it always purposeful, or is, because it seems like the whole European Indian thing is just kind of like accidental progressivism, just like a result of us moving to where Indians are.
Yeah.
Because like Marxism is like, I want to progress in this way, and this is how this has to be.
Yeah, no, that's a great question.
Would you define those two different things as the same progressivism?
Yeah, they're progressive, but they have different, just like there are different shapes of conservatism and liberalism, and there are different shapes of progressivism. And Turner would actually say, so the guy who came up with the Indian and American thing, well, he's not the first. Actually, James Fenimore Cooper made the same argument in his leather stocking tales. But the idea is there is a purposefulness in it, but it's more that wherever the Saxon people go, they always interact with the natives in that way and create this thing. So it becomes a kind of cultural destiny or almost a racial destiny. And that's also, we didn't have time to get to it today, but that's why I also wanted you to read that Thomas Hart Benton piece, The Destiny of the Race, because there you have and we'll talk about that on Friday, but there you get that argument for that as well. Okay, last thing, guys, we've just got about 20 seconds left. So just make sure that for Friday, and I know not all of you will be here, and no problem, we will have a class, but if you guys, I understand if you're not here, believe me. I want to talk about Andrew Jackson and de Tocqueville. So the readings that you have, the first annual message from Jackson, Democracy in America from de Tocqueville, And then we'll talk about the Thomas Hart bet and the racism piece as well. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Fun class. I'll see you on Friday.
Didn't want to do it
Thanks
on-
for reading.
Oh, always a pleasure. Didn't want to draw it on too